What's up, AP peeps? We have Alan Brinkley's Chapter 16 review video for you today from his American history textbook, The Conquest of the Far West. Lots of important stuff to cover in here. Lots of multiple choice questions come from this chapter on past AP exams, so let's get going.
About the impact of the Transcontinental Railroad. So when we're talking about westward settlement post-Civil War, many people are migrating out west due to the hope of economic opportunities and also government policies, whether it is the Homestead Act that provided land like for this family or subsidies to railroads. The government played an active role in encouraging westward migration. As a result of this, treaties with natives were often violated, and violence and conflict occurred between settlers, natives, and Mexican Americans as a result of expansion, especially with natives as the U.S. expanded west. And remember, there is no clear description in the Constitution with how to interact with Native Americans. So the government's response to Native resistance was conflict, and we see lots of military force, including Chief Joseph, who tried to flee, and he finally gave up and said, "My heart is heavy, no longer will I fight." Custer's last stand, which was when the natives killed General Custer and all his men. And this picture here, the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890, which is essentially the last battle between the U.S. military and natives, in which hundreds of Native Americans, most notably, especially women and children, were killed. And natives were also placed onto small reservations, and the hope was to end tribal identities. And native identities were also changed through assimilation, most notably the Dawes Act. They did things like cut Native Americans' hair, encouraged children to go to boarding school, and many of them were forced onto small areas of land to farm.
All right, the changing Western economy. It's important to know that the West became increasingly connected to the East at this time, and in large part, this was due to railroads. And we begin to see new industries develop out west, such as cattle, mining, etc. And the West was often seen as a place of opportunity for all. And this is known as the safety valve theory. Be familiar with the safety valve theory. This was an idea that in tough economic times, one could always move west and start anew. So if you lose all your money in the east, there's always this hope that you can move out west, start a farm, and make lots of money out west. Labor in mines was very arduous and dangerous. They had the highest percentage of people die on the job. The cattle industry is booming during this time. It is a large business for some, and even Teddy Roosevelt tries to get in on the cattle industry in the 1880s in the Dakotas. And this could be very unstable, as Teddy Roosevelt even found out. The winters of 1885 to 86, and also the following year of 86 to 87, were very, very cold, and lots of people lost lots of cattle, and some people would even go bankrupt. Another important thing to know about the West is that women's suffrage was higher in the West than in the East. And Wyoming here was the first state to guarantee women's suffrage. So out West, it was actually kind of more democratic in certain areas. Okay, so the West is romanticized at this time, and it's done so by a variety of ways. We see the Rocky Mountain School, which is very similar to another school you've learned about earlier. You should absolutely know the Hudson River School, and they painted landscapes, both the Hudson River and the Rocky Mountain School. And here is a painting that was done. And if you forget these, look at both Rocky Mountain and Hudson River, and you think to yourself, those are geographic features. You see that's a school, so what would they be interested in? They are interested in painting landscapes or geography. Do not sleep on the Hudson River School. It has appeared on AP exams before. So why was the West so appealing? Well, there's this book, The Virginian, that romanticized the cowboy. You see a lot of people really start to fall in love with the idea of a cowboy, this tough, rugged individual who is making a name for himself and making money out west. And the West was seen as the last frontier, like really the final place in the United States that you could go and kind of make money. Speaking of the frontier, you cannot talk about the frontier without talking about this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner. And I do have a video on him and the frontier and his whole thesis you can check out in the description below. He wrote a very famous piece of writing called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he used the 1890 census data and argued that the frontier ended in 1890. And you can see here, the green on the map is by 1890. And you can see that a lot of this country is really settled in and occupied. There's not a lot of empty land left anymore. He argued that the frontier closed in 1890. He also said that the frontier gave America a unique identity and it helped promote democracy. Okay, we're going to start talking about Native Americans, and I am very surprised that this book does not mention Helen Hunt Jackson. She has appeared on numerous AP exams, and you absolutely positively must know Helen Hunt Jackson in the book she wrote. And the book she wrote is A Century of Dishonor. And believe it or not, this book was about a 100-year time period, and it chronicled the deceit, abuse, and broken treaties between the federal government and Native Americans. And there is Helen Hunt Jackson. You absolutely positively must know Helen Hunt Jackson. During and after the Civil War, conflicts increased between the government and Native Americans. The Indian Peace Commission was set up, and they recommended to move the Plains Indians to reservations in Oklahoma and Dakota. So you begin to see that this idea for a little while is to put Native Americans on reservations. And the theory is that they'll be left alone there, but we'll see that's not really true. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was created to distribute land and supplies to Native Americans. It was not very successful. You had a lot of corrupt individuals who were a part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Buffalo, as I mentioned earlier, were a huge part of the Plains Indians, and they almost became extinct in part because of people like Buffalo Bill Cody and the railroad companies. They would hire people to just kill the buffalo to get out of the way for the railroad companies to build tracks and not be in the way of the railroad companies. Buffalo Bill Cody became so famous, he had his own Wild West show and made lots of money. Okay, we're going to talk about some conflicts with Native Americans. You should definitely be familiar with all of these, but the ones that are starred, pay special close attention to because those are the ones that appear most often. The Sand Creek Massacre was a massacre that involved 133 natives being killed, and 105 of them were women and children. And sadly, we'll see this happen to Native Americans. A lot of times, we'll see women and children killed. In California, there was this unofficial policy known as Indian hunting, in which many people were encouraged to kill Native Americans, and 5,000 of them were killed between 1850 and 1880. And we'll see in California between the Civil War and 1870, the population of Native Americans decreases from 150,000 to 30,000. Now, that wasn't all done by killing. Some of it was done by diseases, and some of it was done by Native Americans leaving. But you do see a drastic reduction, sadly, in Native Americans in California. The Battle of Little Bighorn, which is also known as Custer's Last Stand, and here's a painting of that, was a clash between Native Americans and George Custer and 264 of his men who were all killed. Every white federal troop was killed in this battle. Nez Perce was a Native American tribe led by this guy, Chief Joseph, and he urged his members to flee, and he almost made it to Canada, but he was caught before getting to Canada, and when he was caught, he said, "I am tired, my heart is sick and sad, I will fight no more forever." So Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce are giving up their fighting with the federal government. All right, here are the stars that I was talking about in the last slide. The ghost dance. Definitely know the ghost dance. This was a ritual that Native Americans would do, and they believed that the buffalo would return and the whites would leave the natives alone. The whites would actually leave the plains, they envisioned. And this terrified a lot of people in the government. So the government wanted to end the dance. This helps lead to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Definitely know Wounded Knee. This was fighting between soldiers and natives in South Dakota. 40 soldiers and 300 plus Native Americans were killed, and many of those, again, sadly, were women and children. And here's a very famous picture from the Battle of Wounded Knee. The Dawes Act was passed in 1887 and is a hugely important act in Native American history. This drastically changes the lifestyle of Native Americans. The purpose was to assimilate. Be able to see that word assimilate. If you see the Dawes Act, the first thing you should think of is assimilate. That essentially means this idea of trying to Americanize Native Americans. And the government did so by eliminating tribal land and provided 160 acres of land for individuals. So it's collectively removing Native Americans and breaking from this land and breaking it up and giving it to individuals. And some Native American children were even sent to boarding school to help, quote unquote, become American. And the goal of this was also to promote Christianity and change the religion of Native Americans.